Chapter 1. The Impossible Clue. It was during one of those grey and indecisive London afternoons, neither rain nor sun, just a sullen mist hanging heavy over Baker Street, that I found my old friend Sherlock Holmes in a most unusual posture. He was reclined upon the divan with his long fingers interlocked across his chest, staring up at the ceiling as if willing the plaster to speak. I just returned from my practice in Kensington, where a bout of winter colds had kept me buried in consultations. Upon entering our shared sitting room at 21B, I paused at the threshold. Holmes, usually energetic even in repose, was unnervingly still. "Holmes?" I ventured, unsure whether I was interrupting deep thought or a much-needed nap. He stirred faintly, his eyes shifting toward me with the same penetrating lucidity I'd come to expect from him in the moments before a deduction. "Ah, Watson," he murmured. "You are earlier than expected. The air in Kensington must have grown unfit for patience." "It's the fog," I said, removing my coat. "Even the healthy have taken to bed with invented ailments to avoid it. And have you been lying there all morning?" He sat up slowly, reached for his pipe, and struck a match. "Not all morning. Only since I returned from a most peculiar consultation." "A case, then?" I asked eagerly, taking my seat by the fire. Holmes exhaled a ribbon of smoke and nodded. "One that defies logic and probability, and therefore quite promising." "Tell me," I said. "Or would you rather string me along with cryptic remarks until you reveal the solution all at once?" "Patience, Watson. The seed must first be planted before we may admire the bloom." He reached into the pocket of his smoking jacket and, to my astonishment, withdrew a delicate white feather, soft, nearly translucent, and no longer than my index finger. He laid it carefully upon the table between us, as if it were the Rosetta Stone. "A feather?" I asked, squinting at it. "Is this the case? A missing bird?" "Not quite. This feather," Holmes said, "was found in the waistcoat pocket of a dead man who, by all appearances, had no earthly reason to possess it." I leaned forward. "A murder, then?" "A death," Holmes corrected, "whether accidental, self-inflicted, or the work of a calculating mind. That is what we must determine. The details, as conveyed to me this morning by Inspector Lestrade, are these." He paused, drawing again from his pipe, eyes flickering with that familiar light, part curiosity, part irritation at the stupidity of ordinary men. "Last night, in a small but affluent residence on Gadsden Square, one Algernon Beckwith was found dead in his study, locked from the inside. No sign of forced entry. The only key to the room was in his trouser pocket." "Ah," I murmured. "One of those cases." "Indeed," Holmes said. "The window was latched, the chimney too narrow for any adult to descend, and no hidden doors or passages were discovered. The scene was immaculate. No sign of struggle save for a toppled inkwell. He was found seated at his writing desk, head slumped forward as though he had merely dozed off." "But—" Holmes tapped the feather. "This was found in his waistcoat pocket, and on the desk lay a single sheet of paper, stained with ink, but otherwise blank." "Was he ill?" I asked, "or of fragile health?" 48, athletic, with a reputation as an amateur mountaineer. No history of fainting or delirium. According to Lestrade, the preliminary examination revealed no wounds or signs of poison. The doctor who examined the body, some fellow named Timmins, was completely baffled. "And the feather?" I asked. "What sort is it?" "That," Holmes said, "is the first curiosity. It appears to belong to no bird native to Britain. I have already sent a telegram to the British Museum's Ornithology Department for identification." "Still," I said, thinking aloud, "a feather is hardly a weapon, unless, of course, it was laced with poison." "A fanciful theory, Watson," Holmes said with a dry smile, "though one I do not rule out entirely. But here's the crux. Beckwith's manservant swears that his employer never kept birds, never wore feathers, and had not left the house in 3 days due to a stubborn cold. No guests, no deliveries, nothing out of the ordinary, until the locked door and the sudden silence. I found myself leaning in, now fully engaged. And who discovered the body? The housekeeper. She was bringing him his evening tea, as she always does. When he didn't answer, she summoned the manservant. He, in turn, attempted to force the door, but failed. A carpenter was called to remove the hinges from the outside. That was how they gained entry. And nothing else was missing? No signs of robbery? Holmes shook his head. Not a coin out of place. But here lies the devil of the thing, Watson. Algernon Beckwith was a man of discipline and habit. According to his household staff, he always placed his fountain pen precisely in its holder, always extinguished the lamp after use, and always removed his waistcoat before settling at his desk to write. But he was wearing it when they found him. Exactly. And within that waistcoat pocket, a feather foreign to this island, a pocket, I must add, that he reportedly never used. I sat back, digesting the scene. A locked room, no sign of violence, a blank page, a misplaced feather, and a dead man in his waistcoat. "What do you think it means?" I asked, half dreading the answer. Holmes smiled faintly. "It means, Watson, that someone went to great lengths to make this death appear dull and unremarkable. But the illusion is imperfect, and in such cracks does the truth begin to show." He rose, tossed aside his robe, and reached for his coat. "Come. The cab will be here in moments. We are to visit Gadsden Square and inspect the scene for ourselves." "In this fog?" I asked, peering out the window. "In this fog," he echoed. "For if I'm not mistaken, this mist may conceal more than merely carriages and gaslights. It may yet hide a murderer." Chapter 2. A Study in Details. It was 3:30 when we arrived at Gadsden Square. The fog had thickened to a damp gauze that clung to one's skin and blurred the outlines of the world. Gas lamps glowed like moons behind frosted glass, and the cobblestones beneath our feet were slick with condensation. The house in question, number 17, stood at the western edge of the square, a narrow 3-story Georgian structure of dark brick and shuttered windows. There was nothing particularly remarkable about its appearance, but Holmes paused at the gate and studied the facade with that distant, ruminative gaze I had learned to recognize as the prelude to observation. "No footprints in the garden path," he murmured. "The ground is damp. Anyone entering from the street would leave a mark, yet there are none but ours. Curious." I followed his gaze. The narrow path from the gate to the front stoop was undisturbed, though the soil was soft enough to preserve a boot print. Holmes knelt briefly, touched the gravel, then rose and nodded to the front door. A housemaid greeted us after a brief knock and led us through the narrow corridor to the study at the rear of the house. The atmosphere inside was hushed, the sort of unnatural silence that often lingers after tragedy. The parlor curtains were drawn, and a faint scent of pipe smoke hung in the air. Ghostly remnants of a life so recently interrupted. Lestrade was already there, examining a paperweight on the writing desk. He straightened upon seeing Holmes. "About time," he said, though without malice. "The body's been removed to St. Christopher's morgue, but the room's untouched otherwise. I've had my men keep everyone out until you arrived." Holmes offered a nod and moved into the room without a word. I followed, already noting the layout. A tall window overlooking the back garden, a mahogany writing desk beneath it, bookcases lining the left wall, and 2 leather armchairs positioned before a fire now reduced to embers. The desk itself was modest and orderly, save for the toppled inkwell Lestrade had mentioned and the blank sheet of paper, now dry and stiff. Holmes moved with deliberate care, first examining the chair, then the position of the inkblot, and finally the desk drawer, which he opened and rifled through quickly. He held up the feather once more, now wrapped in a linen handkerchief, and regarded it beneath the light of a gas lamp. "This," he said, "is not a common feather. Note the delicate barbs, the tapered shaft. It is soft, downy, not a quill. And yet—" He turned it slowly in his fingers, eyes narrowing. I could not say what he saw in it, but I knew better than to ask prematurely. Lestrade crossed his arms. "It's certainly peculiar. The servants say they've never seen it before. Nor had Beckwith any birds, nor interest in them." Holmes walked to the fireplace. The hearth was clean, too clean. He knelt and retrieved a poker, gently shifting the ashes. "No charred paper," he murmured. "No attempt to destroy evidence. Yet someone has swept this grate within the last day or two. Look at the soot patterns, Watson." I stooped beside him. The ashes were faint, hardly enough to have come from a recent fire. Holmes ran his finger along the inner wall of the hearth and showed me the clean streak it left. "Burned thoroughly, and then cleaned," he said. "Who performed this task?" Lestrade gestured to the maid who hovered in the doorway. "You there? Did you clean the fireplace?" The girl shook her head, pale and anxious. "No, sir, not in the study. Mr. Beckwith never liked anyone fussing about in here. He tended it himself." Holmes turned. "When did you last see him alive?" "Yesterday afternoon, sir," she replied. "He took lunch in the parlor and came back here shortly after. Said he wasn't to be disturbed. That was the last any of us saw him." "And the house was locked for the night?" "Yes, sir, as always. Mr. Beckwith was particular about bolts and chains." Holmes gave a slight nod and stood. "Who else was in the house?" "Only Mr. Beckwith, me, cook, and Mr. Darren, the valet." Holmes turned back to Lestrade. "Interview them all, one at a time. No grouping. Separate rooms." "Already begun," Lestrade said, a touch of pride in his voice. "Darren's in the kitchen. I've had the maid and cook upstairs. You want a word with them?" "In due course," Holmes replied. He now turned his attention to the room itself. He paced the perimeter, noting scuffs on the wooden floor, the unlit candle beside the bookshelf, and the faint smear of something, perhaps dust or soot, on the curtain's edge. Then he stopped and pointed. "Watson, the window." It was shut and latched from within, but just beside the sill there was a narrow impression, hardly visible, on the interior wall. Holmes leaned in and retrieved a folded scrap of paper jammed into the molding. He unfolded it carefully. It was blank. I raised an eyebrow. "Another blank sheet?" "2 blank pages," he said softly. "In a room with an open inkwell and a blot. One might think Beckwith intended to write, but never did." "Or someone else wrote and removed the message," I said. Holmes smiled faintly. "Or someone else wrote, then took extraordinary measures to ensure nothing remained, including cleaning the fireplace." Lestrade cleared his throat. "You suspect someone burned a letter?" "I suspect someone attempted to erase more than Mr. Beckwith's life. They wanted to erase why." He turned to me suddenly. "Watson, how much do you recall of the Van Lowe feather scandal?" "The what?" "Ah," Holmes said. "Never mind. A long-forgotten diplomatic incident. It may be nothing, or it may be everything." His gaze drifted once more to the feather, resting now upon the blotched page like a ghostly signature. "There is something missing," he said at last. "Something Beckwith knew or discovered that prompted silence, perhaps even fear. This feather is not a message, Watson. It is a warning." "A warning from whom?" Holmes's face was unreadable. "That," he said, "we shall soon find out." Chapter 4. The Gathering of Suspects. By the time Holmes had finished his meticulous survey of the study, dusk had settled upon Gadsden Square. The fog still hung heavy outside the windows, diffusing the golden glow of the gas lamps and lending the entire house an atmosphere of oppressive quietude. Lestrade had arranged for the household to remain under temporary seclusion, and one by one the inhabitants of number 17 were summoned to the small parlour adjoining the main hallway for private interviews. Holmes insisted we observe each session closely, taking careful note of every hesitation, every glance, and every misstatement. The first to enter was the valet, Mr. Darren. He was a lean, dark-haired man in his mid-30s with sharp features and a faint air of disdain he attempted to disguise behind clipped politeness. His suit was impeccably pressed, though his collar bore the faint trace of nervous sweat. "You were Mr. Beckwith's personal valet?" Holmes asked without introduction. "For 5 years, sir," Darren replied, "since he returned from the Cape Colony." "You were with him in South Africa?" "No, sir. I joined his service after his return to London." Holmes tilted his head slightly. "Did he speak often of his time abroad?" Darren hesitated. "Rarely, sir. Mr. Beckwith was a private man. He kept his memories, whatever they were, closely guarded." "Did he receive visitors?" "Occasionally. Mostly former military men or members of his mountaineering club. Nothing unusual." Holmes leaned forward. "And in the last week?" "Only one caller, sir. A gentleman, middle-aged, foreign accent, arrived late one evening 3 nights ago. Mr. Beckwith received him in the study and instructed me not to interrupt. They spoke for perhaps 20 minutes. I never saw the man's face clearly." "A foreign accent? Could you place it?" "Eastern European, perhaps. Rough. Not someone I'd heard before." Holmes and Lestrade exchanged a glance. "And what of the feather?" Lestrade asked, leaning against the mantel. "Ever seen anything like it?" Darren's eyes flicked to the handkerchief Holmes had left on the table, the tip of the white plume peeking out. "No, sir. Never." "Very well," Holmes said. "You may go. Send in the housekeeper." As Darren stepped out, Holmes made a note in his small leather-bound book. "Too polished," he muttered. "Too deliberate. Did you notice the tremble in his fingers when he spoke of the visitor?" "I did," I said. "But it could be nerves. A man in service is often ill at ease in official interviews." Holmes gave me a look, one of his mild, indulgent smirks, and said nothing. Mrs. Keyes, the housekeeper, entered next. She was a short, plump woman with reddened cheeks and shrewd eyes. Her hands twisted her apron as she sat, but her gaze was steady. "How long were you with Mr. Beckwith?" Holmes asked. 7 years, sir. I managed the household before he went abroad and resumed when he came back. He was always fair, if a bit aloof." "Aloof?" She nodded. "Kept to himself, sir. Didn't like to be asked questions, but he paid wages on time and never raised his voice. A quiet man." "Was he nervous recently? Any change in his behavior?" Mrs. Keyes seemed to consider. "Not nervous, exactly. But he did seem preoccupied these last few days. He would stare out the study window for long spells. Once I heard him mutter something about ghosts not staying buried, though when I asked what he meant, he told me I'd misheard." Holmes's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Ghosts?" She shrugged. "Could have been anything. He never explained." "And the visitor Mr. Darren mentioned?" "I saw a man in a dark overcoat come in after hours. That was unusual. Mr. Beckwith never entertained guests at night. I asked Mr. Darren who it was, but he didn't know either." Holmes tapped his fingers together thoughtfully. "Did you happen to see what the gentleman left with?" "No, sir. I never saw him leave." "Thought he must have gone out the back, though the kitchen staff say they didn't see him." Holmes nodded. "Thank you, Mrs. Keyes." She rose, wiped her hands on her apron, and left. The final member of the household to be interviewed was the cook, a large woman named Elsie with soot-smudged cheeks and a thick Yorkshire accent. She had little of substance to add, save that she'd heard Beckwith arguing with someone in the study the night of the mysterious visit. "I didn't catch the words," she admitted, "but the tone wasn't friendly." After she left, Holmes rose and paced the parlor in silence. His long fingers drummed lightly against the back of an armchair, and his gaze seemed fixed on nothing. Lestrade looked up from his notes. They're an ordinary bunch, if you ask me. No clear motive in sight. That, Holmes said quietly, is what makes them so interesting. He turned to me. Watson, what struck you about their accounts? I hesitated. The foreign visitor. All three mentioned him, but only Darren claims to have spoken to him. Just so, Holmes said. And note the peculiar absence. None of them saw the man leave. A person enters, leaves no name, no trail, and then vanishes without even a footstep in the garden path. Even in fog, one might expect some trace. What do you suspect? I asked. I suspect, Holmes replied, that this man was never meant to be seen, or perhaps never meant to exist at all. Lestrade looked skeptical. Couldn't Beckwith have slipped him out the back gate? Holmes shook his head. The cook saw no one, and Darren was near the rear corridor the entire evening. No, if someone came, they left another way, or they never left at all. Are you suggesting the visitor remained in the house? Holmes turned toward the fire and stared into it as though it held the answer. I suggest, Watson, he said slowly, that we are dealing not with a moment of violence, but with a long simmering secret, one that was coming due. He picked up the feather once again. And until we know why this was left behind, we shall remain at the threshold of understanding. There was a knock at the parlor door. One of Lestrade's men entered, hat in hand. Message just came for you, Mr. Holmes, he said, handing over a folded telegram. Holmes read it silently, his eyes scanning the page in seconds. He folded it with a snap. From the British Museum, he said. They've identified the feather. And? I asked. Holmes turned to me, the firelight catching in his eyes. It comes from a species that has not been seen in Britain for over 30 years, he said. One thought extinct. He let that statement settle into the silence before continuing. And its only known habitat, Watson, was in the mountains of southern Africa, near the same region where Mr. Beckwith once vanished for 3 weeks during a storm, and returned, changed. Chapter 5. First Suspects. The red herring. The following morning broke with a grim sky and the same persistent fog that had draped London in ghostly shrouds since our arrival at Gadsden Square. I found Holmes in his dressing gown, seated cross-legged in his armchair at 221B Baker Street, breakfast untouched on the table beside him. The feather, still wrapped in linen, rested near his violin case, as though it had earned a place among his most curious possessions. He was silent as I entered, fingers steepled beneath his chin. I knew the signs well. He had spent the early hours reconstructing the crime not by evidence alone, but by logic, imagination, and psychological insight. It was as if Holmes lived inside the minds of his suspects until one thought out of place betrayed the truth. There's a development, I said, handing him the morning edition of the Telegraph. Page 4. Holmes took the paper and scanned the page. His eyes narrowed. Death of Algernon Beckwith still unexplained. Police pursue valet, he read aloud. Ah, Lestrade moves quickly. He believes Darren is our man, I said. Apparently, the inspector has found inconsistencies in Darren's employment history. He once worked under a different name in Brussels, where he was dismissed for theft. Holmes lowered the paper, and that may explain why he changed his name. But theft does not equal murder. Still, I offered, it places him in a favorable position to access Beckwith's room. He knew the household routines, and the argument overheard by the cook occurred shortly after the mysterious visitor left, or didn't leave. Holmes stood and crossed the window, pulling aside the curtain with a distracted air. Yes, Darren makes for a convenient culprit. He has motive, means, and a murky past. The police must be delighted. You disagree? I find it all far too convenient. Watson. Holmes turned from the window and tapped the newspaper thoughtfully. Darren's silence about his past is telling, yes. But Beckwith was a man who trusted few. To hire a man like Darren for 5 years, without discovering the truth, would have been unlike him. Unless, of course, Beckwith already knew. Knew and didn't care. Knew and kept him close, Holmes said, perhaps even because of his history. There was a knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram on a small tray. Holmes took it, thanked her, and opened the envelope swiftly. "From Lestrade," he said. "They've arrested Darren. He was found attempting to leave London by train this morning. He had a forged passport, £30 in cash, and a revolver in his suitcase." I felt a chill. "That seems rather conclusive, wouldn't you say?" "Not at all," Holmes replied calmly. "It seems like desperation, yes. Guilt? No. I suspect Darren knows something, perhaps too much, and fears becoming the next victim." Holmes tossed the telegram onto the breakfast table. "Come, Watson. The prison cells await. Let us see what our valet truly knows." The cells at Bow Street Station were cold and bare, lit by pale gaslight and permeated by a faint odor of damp stone. Darren sat on the edge of a narrow cot, his eyes heavy with sleeplessness. His jacket had been removed and his cuffs undone, but he sat upright with a strange, soldierly tension. He looked up as we entered. "I suppose you're here to confirm I'm the villain," he said bitterly. "Not at all," Holmes said, taking the stool opposite him. "I'm here because you tried to flee." I panicked. "Why?" Darren hesitated. I told the truth. About the visitor. About not seeing him leave. "And the feather?" Holmes asked. "Have you recalled anything else?" Darren exhaled slowly. "I found it on the floor 2 days before Beckwith died, in the front hallway. I thought it belonged to some woman's hat, perhaps a passing guest. I meant to toss it, but something about it unnerved me. I placed it in my coat pocket and forgot about it." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "Then how did it end up in Beckwith's waistcoat?" "I don't know," Darren whispered. "That's the truth. When I read about it in the papers, I realized someone must have taken it from my coat." "Someone with access to the servants' quarters," Holmes murmured. "Did Beckwith ever mention the feather to you?" "No." Holmes was silent a moment. Then he said, "Tell me about the argument the night before his death, the one the cook overheard." Darren looked up sharply. "You heard about that?" "Yes." He rubbed his face. "It wasn't an argument. It was fear. Beckwith was agitated. He told me to burn a letter he had received without reading it. He kept pacing, repeating the phrase, 'They found me, even here.'" "Did you burn it?" Darren nodded. "I didn't read it, if that's what you're wondering. But I kept the envelope." Holmes's eyes glittered. "Do you still have it?" "I hid it behind a loose floorboard in my quarters. I didn't want to be caught with it if something happened." Holmes stood swiftly. "Watson, we are going to Gadsden Square. With or without Lestrade's blessing." An hour later, we stood once more in the attic quarters above Beckwith's study. Darren's small room was sparsely furnished, a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, a mirror, and a faded print of the Alps above the headboard. Holmes went directly to the floorboards beneath the window and began tapping lightly with the handle of his cane. Within minutes, he had pried up one of the boards, revealing a thin paper envelope sealed in wax. He opened it. No letter lay inside, only a smear of something, red-brown and crusted, along the inner fold. "Blood?" I asked. Holmes shook his head. "No, not blood. Wax, but with a trace of ash and ochre. A ritual pigment." I frowned. "A ritual?" Holmes didn't answer. He turned the envelope over and studied the corner, where an embossed symbol had been pressed into the paper, a circle enclosing 3 feathers crossed at the shaft. He handed it to me. "Do you recognize this?" I shook my head. Holmes' voice dropped. I do. It's the mark of a society Beckwith once investigated in the Transvaal, a forgotten tribe or a cult obsessed with omens and vengeance. They called themselves the Wings of Smoke. A chill crept through me. You believe Beckwith was targeted? I believe, Holmes said, tucking the envelope into his coat, that someone or something from Beckwith's past has returned to finish what began in the mountains. And Darren is not our killer, but he is our bait, and the killer will come back for him. Chapter 6. The Secret Clue. A Hidden Inconsistency. The wind shifted that evening, turning colder, though the city remained veiled in its ever-present fog. As we rode in a hansom cab back toward Baker Street, Holmes remained unusually silent, his long fingers pressed together beneath his chin, his eyes fixed on some distant and invisible point only he could see. I had long learned not to interrupt such silences. Often they birthed revelations, but my own thoughts were restless. Holmes, I said at last, what is it that's bothering you? We've a feather from a bird long extinct in England, a cult that may or may not be real, and a valet who seems both terrified and honest. Yet you are troubled. Holmes stirred, but his eyes remained distant. Something doesn't fit, Watson. One detail, it is out of place, like a single note played off-key in a symphony, and I cannot abide disharmony in a case. And the envelope. The symbol on it confirms a connection to Beckwith's past in Africa, he said, but if we assume this cult or society truly exists, then the crime was not merely personal, it was ceremonial. You believe he was murdered as part of some rite? Holmes hesitated. Perhaps. Or perhaps someone wished it to appear that way. At Baker Street, he leapt from the cab before it had fully stopped and ascended the steps 2 at a time. I followed, puzzled but invigorated. When Holmes moved at that pace, something had ignited in him. Inside, he swept to his desk and opened a drawer. Retrieving a thin file of old newspaper clippings and correspondence, he laid them out across the surface like cards in a game of patience. I saw images of mountain peaks, faded ink drawings of tribal masks, and a few articles bearing the name Beckwith in connection with an expedition to the Drakensberg Mountains in 1896. Holmes tapped a clipping with his forefinger. This is it. I leaned in. The headline read, Expedition delayed after native guide, disappears without trace. Beckwith's party lost a man named Kifaru, Holmes said. He vanished during a snow squall. No body was found. Only his pack and walking staff, discovered beside a single feather, identical to the one now in our possession. I shivered. You think this murder is an echo of that event? I think, Holmes said slowly, that someone wants us to believe it is, but therein lies the inconsistency. He crossed to the fireplace and picked up the envelope Darren had hidden. Look here, Watson. The wax seal. It bears a tribal symbol, yes, but the wax itself is a compound of modern manufacture. It contains elements of carmine dye and processed resin. That formula didn't exist in the Transvaal in 1896. It was developed only last year in London by the Duverne Chemical Company. I blinked. Then, the seal is forged. Precisely. Holmes turned to me, his expression alive with keen intensity. We are being led, Watson, herded like sheep. This death was staged to evoke Beckwith's past. But the one who orchestrated it made a single, fatal error. They used modern materials to mimic ancient terror. A modern mind, then, I said. Not some avenging tribesman, but someone who knew Beckwith's past well enough to fake the symbolism. Just so. He returned to the desk and picked up the feather again. We must ask ourselves, then, who in London would possess both the knowledge of Beckwith's African history and the means to construct this fiction? The expedition members, I offered. Holmes nodded. A natural place to start. He withdrew a slim leather notebook and flipped through its pages. Beckwith's party consisted of 4 men: Major Tristram Vale, Professor Edmund Glass, a financier named Silas Hartley, and Beckwith himself. Vale is deceased. Hartley resides in Cairo, but Professor Glass teaches at King's College, still in London. He snapped the book shut. Tomorrow we pay the professor a visit. Professor Edmund Glass turned out to be a tall, pale man with watery eyes and thin lips that pursed perpetually, as if holding back a thought. His office at King's College was lined with bookshelves, groaning under the weight of tomes in Latin, Greek, and Isizulu. Mounted butterfly specimens adorned one wall. Above the fireplace hung a faded map of southern Africa. "I'd wondered when someone might call," he said, adjusting his spectacles. "I heard about Beckwith's death in the papers." "You knew him well?" Holmes asked, taking a seat without invitation. "Well enough. We spent 2 months in each other's company in the mountains of Natal. A trying experience. Beckwith was a meticulous climber, but not a man to share confidences." "Did he speak of his experiences afterward?" Glass hesitated. "Not directly. But when we returned, he became erratic, distant. He resigned from the Geographical Society and avoided all contact with the rest of us. I assumed he had been shaken by the disappearance of our guide." "Kieferu?" Glass nodded. "Yes. He vanished during a storm. The locals whispered all sorts of things. Curses, spirits, omens. Beckwith, I believe, feared he had brought some misfortune upon us. He was never quite the same. Were there any particular symbols associated with those superstitions?" Holmes asked. Glass blinked. "Feathers. The locals believed that white feathers were left as warnings by the spirits of the wind. Ridiculous, of course." Holmes produced the envelope and offered it for inspection. Glass took it, turned it in his hands, then froze as he examined the seal. "I've seen this before," he whispered, "but not in Africa. This seal, it appeared in a letter Beckwith sent me last year." Holmes's brows lifted. "He sent you a letter?" "Yes," Glass said. "He asked if I had ever told anyone about what happened." He didn't explain further, just that "the ghosts are growing bold," he said. He feared someone was hunting us. "And did you respond?" Glass shook his head. I thought he was mad. Holmes retrieved the envelope. "One last question, Professor. Were you ever in contact with Beckwith's manservant, Mr. Derrin?" "No. Why would I be?" Holmes stood. "Because someone forged this envelope and planted the feather. And only a handful of people could have done so with any authenticity." Glass looked up sharply, suddenly pale. Holmes leaned in, voice quiet. "If you receive any correspondence with this seal again, Professor, do not ignore it. Your life may depend upon it." As we stepped back into the fog-bound street, I turned to Holmes. "You don't trust him?" Holmes gave a slight shake of the head. "No, but I don't distrust him either. What I do believe, Watson, is that someone is reviving Beckwith's past for a purpose, and if Professor Glass received such a warning, he won't be the last." He pulled his coat tight against the cold. "We are no longer solving one death," he said grimly. "We are unraveling a campaign, one that has just begun." Chapter 7. The crime grows stranger. The fog that had blanketed London for the past 3 days began to lift by morning, though the air remained heavy and still, as if the city itself was holding its breath. I arrived at 221B Baker Street shortly after 8, having spent a restless night turning over Holmes's words in my mind. We are unraveling a campaign, one that has just begun. Inside, I found Holmes standing by the fireplace, still in his shirt sleeves, poring over a series of hand-drawn maps and letters spread across the carpet. His pipe was unlit, a sign that he was too absorbed for even that minor pleasure. "Ah, Watson," he said without looking up, "you're just in time. There's been another development." "Another murder?" I asked, heart tightening. No, something far stranger. He picked up a folded note and handed it to me. The message was hastily written in pencil, on stationery bearing the crest of King's College. "Mr. Holmes, come at once. They've come for me." The feather, again. I locked the drawer, but it was moved. I did not imagine it. I was wrong. "Hurry." E.g. I looked up sharply. "Professor Glass?" Holmes nodded. "Delivered by a college porter not half an hour ago." He found the note pinned to the professor's office door, with another white feather pressed beneath the tack. I shivered despite the warmth of the hearth. "You believe someone entered his office during the night?" "More than that, Watson. I believe someone wanted us to know they had done so." Within the hour, we were en route to King's College. Holmes was uncharacteristically terse throughout the journey, responding to my questions with monosyllables and staring out the window as the city clattered past. The porter met us at the steps of the university, wringing his cap in nervous fingers. "Didn't see no one, sir," he told Holmes as we hurried down the corridor. "Found the note just like that, tacked on with a little silver pin. No sign of forced entry. All the doors were locked when I opened the building at dawn." Holmes nodded but said nothing. When we reached Glass's office, the scene that greeted us was curiously anticlimactic. The room was undisturbed. Bookshelves lined the walls, a stack of geological journals rested beside the hearth, and the faded map of southern Africa still hung above the fireplace. But Holmes went straight to the writing desk. "Watson, do you recall the professor's statement yesterday? He said he'd received a letter from Beckwith last year, one bearing the same tribal seal." "Correct. He said he kept no copy." Holmes pulled open the top drawer. Inside, neatly arranged, were several envelopes, a quill, and a leather-bound journal. He reached into the rear corner and stopped. Empty. He held up the small compartment insert, revealing a shallow cavity beneath. "This," he said, "was where the letter lay. You can see the impression it left in the dust, but it is no longer here." "Someone stole it?" I asked. "Someone who knew it was here, and who returned to remove it once Glass confirmed its existence." I turned to the porter. "And Professor Glass? Where is he?" "Not come in today, sir. I figured he'd left the note and gone off in a hurry." Holmes stood still for a moment, his hands clasped behind his back, scanning the room with sharp eyes. Then he pointed to the rug beside the fireplace. "Watson, look." I bent down. Barely visible in the thick weave of the carpet was a faint outline, an oblong smudge with darker fibers in its center. "A footprint," Holmes said. "Not made by Glass. Too large. And see here, bits of fine white powder. Chalk or limestone dust. Not common in this building." "Could it be from the feather?" "Possibly," he replied. "Or from the person who carried it." We left the office, Holmes deep in thought, and returned to the porter. "If Professor Glass returns, do not allow him to leave. Inform Scotland Yard immediately, and send a message to me at Baker Street." The porter nodded, pale-faced. Back at our rooms, Holmes paced the sitting room while I took to my chair, still trying to digest the implications. "Holmes," I said finally, "do you think Professor Glass was abducted?" "No," he said. "I think he ran." "Out of fear?" Holmes nodded. "Fear, and perhaps guilt. There is something in that missing letter, Watson. Something that has spooked the professor into vanishing before its contents become known. But the feather, the message pinned to his door." Holmes turned to me. "A warning or a summons. Whoever is behind this crime wants to eliminate every remnant of Beckwith's past. And Glass may have been next." Then Darren was right to be afraid. "Indeed." He crossed to his desk and opened a slim file labeled Cape Colony, 1896. From it, he withdrew a single sheet of notepaper bearing a name I hadn't seen before. "Watson, do you recall the fourth member of the expedition? Silas Hartley?" "Correct, a financier, according to the expedition notes." He was responsible for funding the climb and for hiring the local guides. He left England shortly after their return and has since been living in Cairo. Holmes tapped the paper. But what if he returned? You think Hartley is in London? I think someone with intimate knowledge of that expedition, its failures, its secrets, and its symbols, is moving through the city, erasing all traces of what occurred. But why now? Why so many years later? Holmes turned to the window, where a ray of morning light finally broke through the haze. That, he said, is the great question, and it is one we must answer before the next feather is delivered. There was a knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram. Holmes opened it, eyes scanning swiftly. Well, he said with a note of grim satisfaction, we shan't have to wait long. He handed it to me. The message read, To Mr. Holmes. Urgent. Attempted break-in at 17 Gadsden Square. Study ransacked. No signs of forced entry. Darren, unharmed but shaken, claims he heard whispering outside his door. Lestrade. I looked up at Holmes. Back to the scene of the crime? He smiled thinly. Indeed, Watson. It seems the past is not finished speaking, and we must listen before it kills again. Chapter 8. Holmes tests a theory. By the time we arrived at number 17 Gadsden Square, the sun had begun its descent behind the fog-laced rooftops, casting the neighborhood in a dreary amber glow. Inspector Lestrade stood on the front steps with 2 constables behind him, his usual air of hasty confidence replaced by something more subdued. You took your time, Holmes, he grumbled. This business is getting out of hand. I come when the clues are warmest, not when they scream the loudest, Holmes replied mildly. Now then, walk me through it. Lestrade led us inside. The break-in was discovered just after 2 o'clock. Darren heard strange noises, scratching, almost like whispering from the corridor outside his quarters. When he investigated, he found the study door ajar. The lock wasn't broken, but the interior... Lestrade paused, gesturing toward the room. Holmes pushed open the door. The once orderly study was in disarray. Books had been swept from shelves, drawers upturned, papers scattered across the floor like leaves after a storm. Even the hearth rug had been pulled aside, exposing the bare boards beneath. Holmes moved with quiet precision, scanning the room, his hands held behind his back. I watched as he stopped beside the fireplace, knelt, and gently brushed aside the papers near the hearth. A single white feather lay beneath them. Holmes picked it up using the edge of his handkerchief. No signs of forced entry, you say? He asked Lestrade without looking up. None. Windows and doors locked from the inside. No footprints outside either. No mud, no scuffs. Nothing. And Darren, shaken but unhurt, claims he never saw anyone, just heard the noises and arrived too late. Holmes examined the hearth carefully, tapping the floorboards around it with his cane. Watson, he said suddenly, does this layout seem odd to you? I looked around. Aside from the mess? Exactly. The mess is too deliberate, sweeping, theatrical, the sort of disorder meant to suggest someone was searching for something. You believe it was staged? Holmes stood, feather in hand. Yes, and not for our benefit, at least not directly. This was a message. Lestrade stepped forward. A message to whom? Holmes turned the feather over. To Darren. And perhaps to us. He crossed to the desk and retrieved a small velvet pouch from the drawer, containing the original feather we had discovered in Beckwith's waistcoat. He held both feathers side by side in the fading light. Identical, he murmured. Same curvature, same stiffness, same trace of red at the tip. And yet, he opened his coat and produced a magnifying glass. Through it, he studied the quills. This one, he said, holding the newer feather aloft, has been clipped. See the base? It's been trimmed with a knife. The original bore the natural tear of molting. Lestrade frowned. So? So whoever planted this feather is not the same person who left the original. A different hand is at play now. A silence fell. Holmes, I asked slowly, are you suggesting there are two individuals behind this mystery? Or more, he said. The original murder, Beckwith's death, was personal. It bore the hallmarks of deep knowledge, careful staging, but this intrusion lacks subtlety. It is clumsy in comparison, like a mimic repeating another's crime without understanding the craft. He turned to Lestrade. And you found nothing missing? Not that we can tell, though Darren swears a locked drawer was opened. Which one? Lestrade gestured toward the cabinet in the far corner. Holmes crossed to it and examined the handle. Scratches. Fresh ones. And what's this? He removed a small sliver of wood lodged near the lock. Holding it to the light, he studied the edge. Crude toolwork. Not a lockpick, but something improvised. A hairpin or coat hook, perhaps. Done hastily. He stood. I believe someone was searching for something very specific. Perhaps a document, perhaps a relic. Whatever it was not found. Yet the intruder left behind the feather deliberately, ensuring Darren would discover it. Why? I asked. Holmes's eyes gleamed. To provoke him, to unnerve him. Or perhaps to lure him into revealing something he has yet to confess. He moved back to the hearth and stood quietly for a long moment, eyes flicking across the room. Then he said softly, "We need to lay our own trap." Lestrade straightened. "What are you planning?" Holmes turned. "I wish to test a theory, but for it to work, Darren must remain in the house, undisturbed. You must assign a man to watch the street and the back garden, but not the interior. The moment Darren is left alone tonight, our intruder may return." Lestrade folded his arms. "And you'll be watching?" Holmes smiled faintly. "From somewhere they won't expect." That evening, under Holmes's direction, we returned to number 17 just after dusk. Darren was pale and tight-lipped, but agreed to remain in his quarters. Lestrade's men took up watch on the perimeter. Holmes and I concealed ourselves in the attic above the study, where a small lattice vent provided a narrow but clear view of the room below. The wait was long. Midnight came and went. The gas lamps outside flickered against the rising fog. I stifled a yawn and glanced at Holmes, who remained statue still, his eye pressed to the vent. And then I heard it. A soft creak from the stairs. Holmes raised a finger. A shadow passed across the lower corridor. Then a figure slipped into the study. Even in the dim light we could see. He moved with care, quiet, deliberate. He crossed to the desk, pulled open the same drawer, and this time removed something, a folded piece of paper. Holmes tensed, but the figure paused and pulled something else from his coat, another feather. He placed it on the hearth near the dying embers and began to retreat. Holmes was up in a flash. "Now, Watson!" We burst from the attic, down the servants' stairs, and into the study. The intruder spun, eyes wide, face half covered by a scarf. But it was too late. Lestrade's constables stormed in through the rear door, cutting off escape. The figure surrendered with a shuddering breath. Holmes stepped forward and removed the scarf. The face beneath was young, too young. "A student," I said, confused. Holmes's mouth was tight. "Not just a student, a messenger." He turned the young man toward us. "Tell me," Holmes said coldly, "who sent you, and what were you promised for your performance?" The boy said nothing, but the paper he had taken from the drawer, now in Holmes's hand, spoke volumes. It bore a symbol, 3 crossed feathers, stamped in crimson wax. Chapter 9. A second attempt. The culprit strikes again. The following morning broke heavy with rain, its steady drumming against the windows of 221B Baker Street, a fitting accompaniment to the grim air that had settled over our lodgings. Holmes had said very little since returning from Gadsden Square in the early hours of the morning. He sat now at his desk, unmoving, the mysterious crimson-sealed letter open before him. "It's blank," I said, glancing again at the unfolded parchment. "Not a word of writing." Holmes nodded. "The message is not in what's written, Watson, but in the delivery. This was never meant to be read, only seen. It is an emblem, a warning, or perhaps a signature." I turned toward the boy, our silent intruder, who sat handcuffed to the armchair opposite the fire, Lestrade's men watching him closely. The young man, no more than 18, hadn't spoken since his arrest, save to confirm his name, Clive Morton, a medical student from King's College. No prior record, no known associations. He claimed at first to have entered Gadsden Square on a dare. Holmes had dismissed that story with a wave of the hand. "There's no dare involved in exacting the lock on a drawer," he had said, "nor in forging the identical feather and placing it beside a dying fire. That's mimicry with intent." Now Lestrade stood, hands on his hips. "I've run the boy's name through the yard's records. Clean. But one of our men did some asking around at the college. Turns out he's taken several lectures with Professor Glass and assisted him in cataloguing African artifacts." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Ah, so Glass had a willing acolyte. More than willing, perhaps," I added. "He could have been used, coerced, or simply believed he was helping protect something larger." Holmes stood slowly and walked to Morton. He crouched before the boy, examining him not with hostility, but with cool, analytical interest. "You're not the architect of this plot," Holmes said quietly. "You're a pawn. Someone has played on your admiration, your loyalty, perhaps even your fear." Morton flinched. Holmes's voice dropped. "Tell me, was it the professor himself who sent you last night? Or someone claiming to act in his name?" Morton looked up at last. His lips trembled. "I was told to place the feather by the hearth," he said hoarsely, "and to take a letter from the drawer. That's all. I wasn't to read it. I was promised no harm would come to anyone." "Who told you this?" Holmes pressed. Morton shook his head. "I don't know his name, only that he met me behind the east courtyard at the college. He wore gloves, a scarf. His voice was deep, foreign maybe. He said Professor Glass had gone into hiding and needed my help to protect a secret." Holmes straightened slowly. A secret, or a lie? That afternoon, we returned to Gadsden Square, hoping to glean something more from the scene of the boy's infiltration. But something else awaited us. As we stepped into the hallway, Darren rushed forward. "Mr. Holmes." "Sir, there's been another incident." Holmes's face hardened. "Where?" "The study again. But this time," Darren hesitated, "someone tampered with Beckwith's safe." We followed him at once. The study had been restored to order, but the small wall safe behind Beckwith's bookshelf stood open, its contents emptied. A faint odor of smoke still lingered in the air. Holmes examined the safe. "It's been opened properly, not forced. Whoever did this had the combination." "Beckwith never shared it," Darren insisted. "Not even with me." "Then they deduced it," Holmes murmured. "Or they had access to something Beckwith once wrote down and forgot." Inside the empty safe lay only ash, blackened fragments of paper, charred nearly to dust. Holmes knelt, using tweezers to lift a larger piece. "Watson," he said, holding it under the lamplight, "look at the ink." The fragment showed only 3 partial letters. R.A. in a deep blue script. "A signature?" I asked. "Possibly," Holmes replied. "Or the ending of a word. But this shade, this particular ink, is rare. I've seen it only once before. Beckwith used it in his expedition logs." "You mean those journals stored at the Royal Geographical Society?" "Precisely." Lestrade entered behind us. "You'll want to hear this," he said, holding up a telegram. One of our men spotted someone matching Professor Glass's description boarding a mail train to Southampton early this morning. Traveling under the name George Rowland, with him was a steamer trunk marked for passage on the SS Ambrosia, bound for Cape Town. "South Africa," I breathed. "He's going back." Holmes's expression darkened. "No, Watson, he's not going back. He's running home." By nightfall, we were again gathered at Baker Street, the rain worsening, the lamplight inside casting flickering shadows along the walls. Holmes sat at the table with a fresh sheet of paper before him, sketching out a timeline. I paced, as was often my habit when the case reached this feverish pitch, when the storm no longer gathered, but broke. "What do you believe Glass was after?" I asked. What was in the safe that he needed so desperately to destroy? Holmes didn't answer immediately. He studied the feather on the mantel, the charred ink fragment, and the forged seal from the boy's envelope, all arranged in a neat row like trophies of deduction. "At the heart of it, Watson," he said finally, "is a crime long buried. Beckwith and his party discovered something in the Drakensberg Mountains, something that was not meant to be found. A truth, perhaps, or a crime. Kifaru, the missing guide, was no mere accident. I believe he was sacrificed. Whether for ritual or convenience remains to be seen. You believe Glass was involved in his death? Or complicit in its cover-up? What we are seeing now, the murder of Beckwith, the forgeries, the manipulation of Morton, even the theft of Beckwith's records, are all acts of desperation. Someone is trying to bury the past permanently, and those who know even fragments of the truth are in danger. He stood and approached the window, arms folded. Glass's escape changes the rhythm of the game. It tells us he feared the net was closing, and he's taken the final piece with him. Whatever was in Beckwith's safe, he has now. Lestrade, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "And what about Morton?" "He'll be released into your custody," Holmes said. "He was merely a tool, but keep a man on him. If the real puppeteer tries to silence loose ends, the boy may still be a target." Holmes turned back to the table and pointed at the forged seal. Glass was not acting alone. There is someone else. Someone who knew how to mimic the ritual and understood Beckwith's fears intimately. Another expedition member? Perhaps, Holmes said. Or perhaps someone Beckwith confided in afterward. Someone who believed that whatever happened in Africa must never come to light. He paused, fingers pressing against his lips in thought. "We need to find Hartley." "The financier?" I asked. Holmes nodded. "The forgotten man, the one who paid for it all. His absence is too conspicuous. If he is in Cairo, we need confirmation. If not, then I suspect we shall find him far closer than we imagined." At that moment, Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram. Holmes opened it, read the contents, and handed it to me without a word. To Holmes, 221B Baker Street. Hartley never returned to Cairo. Left no forwarding address. Missing since July. British Consulate, Alexandria. Holmes turned slowly to us. "And now," he said, "our game becomes a hunt." Chapter 10. The true motive begins to surface. It was nearly midnight when Holmes finally spoke again. He had been seated in the same stiff-backed chair for over an hour, the tips of his fingers pressed together in his customary pose of deep contemplation. The fire had died to glowing embers, and the gas lamps cast long, wavering shadows across the sitting room of 221B. "You see, Watson," he said at last, voice low and measured, "it is not merely the disappearance of Hartley that troubles me. It is the timing." "The timing?" I asked, glancing up from the notes I'd been organizing. Holmes nodded slowly. "Beckwith's death occurred 3 days ago. Glass fled this morning, and now we learn Hartley vanished 2 months prior, with no forwarding address, no business dealings, no trace left behind. The symmetry is too precise to be coincidence. You think Hartley may have been silenced first, or he fled. But consider this. Hartley was the one person who financed the entire expedition. He alone would have had access to every contract, journal, and private arrangement made with local guides. If Kieferu's disappearance in 1896 involved foul play, and if that incident is at the heart of the present mystery, then Hartley may have been the only man left who knew everything. I leaned forward. So you suspect Hartley may have been a liability to someone, possibly Glass? Holmes's eyes gleamed. Or Beckwith, or even someone else who never appeared in the official records. There was a long pause. The wind outside howled against the windows, and the rain had begun again, soft and insistent. Watson, Holmes said, rising abruptly, we must speak with someone who was present during the aftermath of the expedition. Someone with no motive to lie and who may recall what others hope to forget. Whom do you have in mind? He strode to the desk and retrieved a folded letter from his files. Major Tristram Vale, deceased as far as the records go. But before his death, he wrote a single report to the Royal Geographical Society, warning of a moral lapse among the expedition members and requesting to withdraw his endorsement of Beckwith's final journal. He passed the letter to me. I read aloud, "What happened on the 6th night in the shadow of Devil's Peak will haunt me to my grave. I wash my hands of the affair, and I fear it shall come back to us. In blood or in madness?" Holmes said softly, "We need someone who knew Vale." That person turned out to be none other than Colonel Reginald Phelps, a retired military man and former chairman of the Royal Geographical Society. Holmes arranged a meeting at the Colonel's Chelsea residence the following afternoon, and we arrived to find him already seated in a sunlit conservatory, sipping tea with the stern formality of a man who had once ordered artillery fire by the syllable. "Sherlock Holmes," he said crisply, extending a hand. "And Dr. Watson, I've followed your exploits with great interest." Holmes bowed. "The admiration is mutual, Colonel. We've come regarding your late associate, Major Tristram Vale." Phelps's face hardened. A good man. Died too early. He was never the same after that blasted expedition. "You mean the Beckwith party, 1896. The Colonel nodded. "They returned as changed men. I remember the night of their debriefing. Beckwith, Glass, and Hartley arrived at the Society offices after hours. Vale was already there, waiting for them. I witnessed their conversation from my study. Though I couldn't hear every word, I saw enough." "What did you see?" Phelps leaned forward. Glass was agitated. Hartley tried to keep things calm, but Beckwith looked haunted. And Vale stood off to the side. I saw him holding something, a journal, I believe, and shaking his head. When Beckwith tried to speak to him, he turned and walked away. Stormed out. That was the last time they were all together, to my knowledge. Did Vale ever tell you what happened in Africa? Not in full, only that something occurred involving their guide. He used the word sacrifice once. Said Beckwith had made a mistake he could never undo. The details, Vale never committed them to paper, but he was adamant that the official expedition report be destroyed. Holmes's eyes glittered. "Was it?" Phelps hesitated. "No. A copy was retained in our sealed archives for historical purposes, but it's not part of the public record." "May we see it?" Phelps didn't hesitate. "For you, Holmes? Of course." That evening we found ourselves in the undercroft of the Royal Geographical Society, lanterns in hand as we followed the Colonel to the archive vault. The scent of parchment and dust filled the air, and the sound of our footsteps echoed off stone and tile. "Here," Phelps said, unlocking a heavy cabinet. He withdrew a leather-bound ledger and handed it to Holmes. The spine bore the year 1896, and a black feather, pressed and preserved, had been tucked between the final pages. Holmes read in silence for several minutes, turning pages slowly, his face unreadable. Then he stopped. "Here it is," he said. "The 6th night. Devil's Peak." I stepped closer. There was a quarrel between Beckwith and Kafaru. Glass attempted to mediate, but failed. Hartley stood by, refusing to interfere. I attempted to restore calm, but tensions had grown. That night, Kafaru vanished. His staff was found by the river's edge, broken. A white feather rested beside it. "Major Tristram Vale." Holmes murmured. The symbols, the feathers. They weren't just tribal lore. They were part of something larger, a ritual that Beckwith attempted to exploit, perhaps to gain the trust of local tribes or secure access to sacred lands. I frowned. But why would anyone resurrect all this now, nearly 3 decades later? Holmes shut the book and turned toward me. Because Beckwith's journals survived. Because someone feared the truth would emerge and ruin reputations, legacies, fortunes. Glass, Beckwith, Hartley. They conspired to hide Kafaru's death, and now that truth threatens to surface. Beckwith perhaps intended to confess in the end, and someone silenced him before he could. And Glass? Glass knew the secret would emerge once Beckwith was dead. He tried to destroy the last remnants, Darren's papers, the safe, the journals. And now he flees to Africa, believing the land that once swallowed the truth will do so again. Holmes turned to the colonel. "We need the ship manifests of the SS Ambrosia. We must confirm whether Hartley ever left London, or whether he too was caught in this spiral of silence and guilt." Phelps nodded grimly. "I'll have them sent to your address." Back at Baker Street, Holmes added the final entries from the journal to our growing timeline. "The motive, Watson," he said, "is not revenge. It is preservation, a desperate attempt to preserve an illusion of honor, one that was shattered long ago in the Drakensberg Mountains." He turned and stared out the rain-streaked window, his voice low and sharp. "And such men, when cornered, will do anything to survive." Chapter 11. The Bait, Holmes's Grand Strategy. 2 days after our excursion to the Royal Geographical Society, the rain had finally abated, and Baker Street stirred under a pale, strained sunlight. But inside 221B, the mood remained far from bright. Holmes was a man possessed. "I have studied their movements, Watson," he said that morning, pacing in front of the fireplace. "Beckwith's death, Glass's disappearance, the missing documents, Hartley's silence. We are not dealing with an amateur. You believe they're all connected? Glass, Morton, even that mysterious figure who instructed the boy." "I do. But we've been playing catch-up," Holmes admitted. "Now, it is time to force a hand." He moved to the table and rolled out a fresh sheet of paper. Across the top, he had written 4 names: Beckwith, Glass, Hartley, Kafaru. A 5th name, Vale, was scrawled in the margin, with a line connecting him to Beckwith and Glass. "This," Holmes said, tapping the diagram, "is not merely a case of murder. It is a preservation of narrative. A legacy, Watson. These men wove a tale of imperial adventure, courage, and exploration. But behind it lay a dark reality. Betrayal, perhaps even sacrifice. And someone has worked hard to keep that story buried." Holmes turned sharply. "Exactly. Which is why we must unearth it, publicly, so our quarry has no choice but to act." "You mean to bait them?" Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Not just bait them, my friend. Force them into revealing themselves." The first step of the plan was a carefully constructed article, penned by Holmes but published under the name of a fictitious military historian, Dr. Percival Green. It appeared in the Illustrated London News under the bold headline, "Secrets of the Summit, the Forgotten Truth of the Beckwith Expedition." The article, while crafted to appear academic, contained several calculated provocations, vague allusions to recently discovered documents, a suggestion that Beckwith's death had reopened an inquiry into past misconduct, and a final tantalizing mention that Professor E. Glass is expected to return to London imminently to provide clarification. Holmes smiled as the proofs went to press. If Glass is indeed aboard the SS Ambrosia, this article will reach London before he does. If he is not aboard, the real conspirator, whoever remains here, will feel the walls closing in. But if the man behind all this is already watching, I asked, won't he see this as a trap? Of course, Holmes said, lighting his pipe. But what choice will he have? That evening, Lestrade stopped by with further news. The shipping line had confirmed that Professor Glass had booked a cabin aboard the SS Ambrosia, but he had not boarded. Instead, a trunk marked with his name had been loaded and sent to the cargo hold, while a steward reported seeing a gentleman fitting the professor's description, speaking with a tall, bearded man near the dock, moments before vanishing into the crowd. A decoy, Holmes muttered. A staged escape. He wanted us to believe he had fled to South Africa. Then where is he now? I asked. Holmes's reply was crisp. Still in London, in hiding, waiting to see if his ruse holds. He turned to Lestrade. We must now make him think it has failed. The following day, a letter was delivered to 221B. It was unsigned and without return address, but Holmes opened it with the care of a man handling volatile chemicals. Inside was a single sheet of thick cream paper. Typed in perfect alignment were 3 lines. You meddle with ghosts. Some histories are meant to fade. The boy will not speak again, nor will you. The summit remains, Sacred Holmes set the paper down and smiled. There it is, Watson, the message we were waiting for. I stared at the page, unease creeping up my spine. What do you mean? The boy will not speak again. Morton, Holmes said grimly. They plan to silence him. At once, Holmes was at the door, coat flying. Come, Watson, there's not a moment to spare. We arrived at Scotland Yard 20 minutes later, and Holmes pushed past 2 startled desk sergeants before reaching the room where Morton was being held. But the chair was empty. No guard. Lestrade caught up to us moments later, panting. Blast it all, we moved him to a holding flat this morning. Safer than the yard, or so we thought. I sent a man to keep watch. Holmes didn't wait for explanations. The address? Norwich Street, above a cobbler's shop. We were in a cab within minutes, but Holmes's jaw was tight and his fingers tapped restlessly on the windowsill. If they get to him first, Watson. We arrived to find the building door ajar. Holmes bounded up the narrow stairs 2 at a time, Lestrade and I behind him. The holding flat was silent. The guard, a young constable, was slumped in the corner, unconscious but breathing. The door to the bedroom had been forced open. Morton was gone. But on the bed was another feather, this one black, and a card bearing a now familiar wax seal, 3 crossed feathers. Holmes examined the bedspread, then the windowsill. They didn't kill him here. They've taken him. To where? He picked up the card. Where the silence began. Devil's Peak? I asked, confused. No, Holmes said softly. Somewhere closer. His eyes drifted toward the window, then fixed on a thought. They're preparing for their endgame, Watson, but they've made a crucial mistake. He turned to Lestrade. Gather your men. Keep watch on every dock, every shipyard. Glass may still try to flee, but I no longer believe he's in command of this game. Then who is? Holmes pocketed the feather. A man still here, still watching, and I intend to look back at him. That night Holmes said little. He remained by the fire well into the small hours, reviewing letters, maps, and notes with mechanical precision. At one point, I found him studying an old railway schedule, then cross-referencing it against Beckwith's travel logs. Watson, he said at last, did you notice the one thing Beckwith never mentioned in his final journal? I frowned. What? Holmes held up a map of Greater London, where he met with Kifaru after the expedition. If the guide survived, even briefly. Beckwith never admitted it. But a local report from 1897, a colonial dispatch, records a man of East African descent being treated for injuries in a mission hospital in Oxfordshire. My eyes widened. "You think Kifaru made it back to England?" Holmes's reply was a whisper. I think the ghost Beckwith feared was real. Chapter 12. The moment of recognition. The following morning found Holmes in a state I had come to recognize as a prelude to revelation. He moved with unnerving precision, methodical, intense, silent except for a brief murmur here and there as he pored over his compiled notes. The clues, once scattered like ash in the wind, had begun to align, at least in his mind. At breakfast, he pushed his tea aside untouched and stared through the window at the pale London sky. "There is a man," he said at last, "who has moved through this case like a shadow, always adjacent, never central. And yet, I now believe he has been orchestrating the entire affair." I looked up from the Times. "You're not referring to Glass?" Holmes shook his head. "No. Glass is merely a surviving conspirator, running out of fear. No, Watson. The hand that moved this chessboard belongs to someone far more patient." "Who, then?" He turned toward the mantel and tapped gently on the preserved feather. "The answer lies not in the journals, not in Beckwith's death or even in Morton's abduction. It lies in the omission we discussed last night." I set my cup down. The missing reference to Kifaru in Beckwith's final journal. "Exactly," Holmes said. "Every man in that expedition wrote detailed accounts, but Beckwith, the man most haunted, said nothing of Kifaru's fate, at least not directly. Which begs the question, did he omit it out of guilt or fear?" I frowned. "You believe Kifaru survived and returned to England?" "I do, and more than that. I believe someone helped him return. Someone with influence, resources, and motive. Someone who then ensured Kifaru vanished again, permanently, once his usefulness had expired." Holmes strode to the shelf and retrieved a thick envelope from our files. From within, he produced a small photograph, a faded image of the expedition team in front of their base camp in South Africa. Beckwith stood tall in the center, flanked by Vale and Glass. On the far right stood a lean African man, half in shadow. "Kifaru," I whispered. Holmes nodded. "Note the figure standing behind him." I peered closer. "That appears to be Hartley?" "Precisely," Holmes said. "And yet Hartley's name appears nowhere in the journal entry for that day. Nor does he mention the photo in any correspondence. He kept himself out of the narrative intentionally." "Why?" I ventured. "Because he knew it would link him to Kifaru?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Because he feared what Kifaru might say." We traveled to Oxfordshire that afternoon, braving the wet countryside roads as a grey mist settled low over the fields. Holmes had traced a report from 1897 referencing a dark-skinned man treated for fever and internal injuries at a small parish infirmary outside Banbury. The patient had vanished after 3 days. The name entered into the logbook was Kafo, likely a misheard or abbreviated version of Kifaru. The infirmary itself had long since shuttered, but a local curate named Reverend Markham, now elderly and housebound, had agreed to speak with us. "I remember the man well," the Reverend said, eyes distant. "He barely spoke English, but he was terrified, kept repeating the same word in his tongue. I could never make it out. He carried a carved stick and had strange markings on his arms. Scars, ceremonial perhaps." "Did anyone come to see him?" Holmes asked gently. The old man nodded. "Yes, a gentleman. English. Arrived the second evening, claimed to be the patient's sponsor. Said he would take responsibility for his care. They left together before sunrise the next day." Holmes leaned forward. "Do you recall his name?" Markham's brow furrowed. "No, but he wore a green overcoat. Tall, distinguished, older than the patient by at least 20 years. I remember thinking the two made a strange pair. Holmes sat back. And you never saw either again? No, only that the gentleman paid generously. Then he was gone. Holmes was quiet during the carriage ride back to London. I knew better than to press him during such times. His mind, like a lock-pick in a complicated mechanism, needed to turn without interference. But just as the city came back into view, he broke the silence. There was one man Beckwith trusted enough to confess to. One man who could make problems disappear. Money, evidence, people. Hartley. Holmes turned to me. No, Watson, Hartley's brother. I blinked. Brother? But I don't recall any mention of him. You wouldn't, Holmes said, because he rarely appeared in public records. He was the silent investor behind Hartley's ventures, the one with political connections and property scattered from London to the colonies. I only found him after cross-referencing the bank accounts tied to the expedition's funding. He handed me a folded scrap of paper. On it was a name, Lord Albert Strathmore Hartley. Elder brother, estate owner, member of Parliament for a time, and, Holmes added grimly, a man obsessed with legacy. Back at Baker Street, Holmes paced as the fire sputtered behind him. Hartley's disappearance is no mystery now. I believe he is dead, and has been for some time, but his brother couldn't allow that to come to light, not with Beckwith's conscience unraveling, not with Kieferu's ghost re-emerging. And so, Lord Hartley moved behind the scenes. He fed Glass just enough to make him desperate. He used Morton to send messages. He left Feathers to unnerve and confuse. And when the plan began to spiral, he had the boy abducted to protect the last veil of secrecy. You believe Lord Hartley is the mastermind? Holmes turned slowly to face me. I know he is. There was a knock at the door. Lestrade entered, breathless. We found Morton. Holmes straightened. Alive? Barely. Abandoned in an empty cottage near Wandsworth. Bound, gagged, but no serious harm. He's at St. Thomas's under guard. Holmes's jaw tightened. And the men who took him? Gone. But, Lestrade handed Holmes a folded note. This was in the boy's pocket. Holmes unfolded the note. A single line was typed across the center. Stop chasing ghosts. You'll find only bones. Holmes crumpled the paper. Watson, he said softly, prepare yourself. We go to Hartley Hall tomorrow, and I believe we shall not be invited in peace. Chapter 13. The Final Attempt to Escape. The next morning broke with a heavy fog, a dense, chalky veil that blanketed London in silence and shadow. It was the kind of weather, Holmes remarked dryly as he adjusted his collar, in which secrets slink across lawns and conspiracies travel unnoticed. By 9 o'clock, we were in a hired motor carriage bound for Hartley Hall, an expansive country estate in Surrey, hidden away behind high hedges and winding roads. The property, as Holmes had confirmed through quiet channels, was still legally in the hands of Lord Albert Strathmore Hartley, a man few had seen in public for over a decade, and whose existence had become a whisper among political and colonial circles. Have you considered that he may not be home? I asked as the trees thickened and the road narrowed. I have considered every possibility, Holmes replied, including the one in which he is waiting for us, with more than just conversation in mind. Lestrade, seated opposite us, checked his revolver. My men are 10 minutes behind, should we need them. Holmes gave him a curt nod. Let us hope their arrival is not necessary. Hartley Hall emerged like a monolith through the fog. Grey stone, turreted, ivy-choked, and devoid of visible life. The windows were shuttered, and only a single plume of smoke rose from a narrow chimney. A manservant, aged and unsmiling, answered the door. He eyed us with vague contempt until Holmes presented a card bearing the name Inspector James Millfield, one of Holmes's well-established aliases from his days dealing with the Foreign Office. "We're here regarding a matter of national security," Holmes said, deadpan. "It concerns Lord Hartley directly." The servant hesitated, then opened the door without a word. The interior of Hartley Hall was as silent as a tomb. Dust clung to the woodwork, and the air smelled of must and old books. We were led down a corridor lined with portraits, all somber men in military dress or colonial garb. One, I noticed, bore a striking resemblance to the faded image of Hartley from the expedition photograph. We were ushered into a library, a vast, vaulted chamber filled with ancient tomes and dark, polished furniture. And there, by the hearth, stood Lord Hartley. He was taller than I'd imagined, his back straight despite his age, his silver hair perfectly combed. He wore a green velvet smoking jacket and held a glass of sherry with the effortless confidence of a man who had never once answered to another. Holmes stepped forward. "Lord Hartley, I presume?" Hartley did not extend a hand. "I was told you'd come. You've made quite a mess, Mr. Holmes." "I tidy what others leave to rot," Holmes replied. "You've hidden behind burned journals and missing witnesses long enough." Hartley sipped his sherry. "So this is about Beckwith. Glass. The guide. Kifaru." His voice did not waver. "Ancient history. What do you hope to accomplish now?" "Justice," Holmes said flatly. "And truth. For the dead, and for those you've manipulated. Glass, Morton, even your own brother." For the briefest moment, something flickered across Hartley's face. Not guilt, but irritation. "My brother was weak," he said coolly. "He let Beckwith's guilt infect him. I tried to shield him from it, but weakness always reveals itself." Holmes took a step closer. "So you silenced Kifaru when he returned. You paid the mission hospital, and when Beckwith showed signs of confession, you orchestrated his death. While Glass, a puppet strung along by guilt and fear, played the role of scapegoat." Hartley didn't deny it. He set his glass down gently. "I protected what mattered," he said. "Reputation, empire. If you'd seen what we saw in the Drakensberg, you'd understand. Kifaru, he was never a guide, he was a guardian, of something older than any British flag. Beckwith violated that. My brother made it worse. And when the expedition began to unravel, I did what I had to do." "So you murdered a man in his own study," I said, unable to contain my disgust. I ensured silence. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "And now?" Hartley smiled faintly. Now I leave." Lestrade stepped forward. "Not without answering to the law." But Hartley raised a hand, and from the corridor behind us came the unmistakable sound of footsteps. I turned just as two large men entered the library, broad-shouldered, cold-eyed, and very clearly armed beneath their coats. "I still have friends in high places," Hartley said smoothly. "And more importantly, I have time. Time to leave this country, to vanish, just as I've done before." Holmes remained unfazed. "Even the most powerful run out of roads eventually." Hartley leaned in, his voice a hiss. "Do you know what Beckwith feared most, Mr. Holmes? That the world would find out he wasn't the hero, that the man we buried with honors had broken something sacred, something that couldn't be undone. I buried the secret with him, and I'll bury you if I must." Holmes turned calmly to Lestrade. "Now." From the rear window, a loud crash sounded, followed by shouts. Lestrade's men had arrived. Hartley's guards turned instinctively toward the sound, just as Lestrade drew his revolver. "Hands where I can see them," he barked. "Move an inch, and I'll drop you." Holmes stepped forward and retrieved a folded letter from his coat. "I believe you'll recognize this," he said, handing it to Hartley. "It's your own handwriting. Instructions to the boy. Sealed with your private crest." Hartley took the letter with a trembling hand. For the first time, his mask slipped. "I'd hoped you'd be too clever to rely on evidence," he murmured. "But of course, you would use what fools discard." "Elementary," Holmes said. Hartley was arrested that afternoon, his transport intercepted en route to the docks. Glass, found days later in hiding near Chiswick, surrendered quietly upon learning his protector had fallen. Morton, though deeply shaken, agreed to testify in exchange for clemency. In the days that followed, newspapers would speak of the scandal at Hartley Hall and the expedition that lied. Beckwith's legacy was re-examined, the journals opened to scrutiny, and at long last, Kieferu's name was entered into the historical record, not as a footnote, but as a victim. It was a week later, on a quiet evening in Baker Street, that Holmes stood once more before the window, smoking in silence. "You knew he'd try to flee," I said. "Of course," he replied. "Men like Hartley never face consequence until cornered. It is not guilt that haunts them, but loss of control. You played him like a fiddle." Holmes turned to me with a faint smile. "No, Watson. I simply waited for him to strike the wrong chord." Chapter 14. Holmes closes in. The final clue. Revealed. The days that followed Lord Hartley's arrest were heavy with the weight of exposed truths. Newspapers buzzed with headlines about betrayal and buried colonial atrocities. The public, ever hungry for scandal wrapped in aristocracy, feasted on the fall of a man once considered a silent pillar of the empire. But Holmes, as always, remained detached from the fanfare. He moved about Baker Street like a man still searching for a final, stubborn splinter. He was not yet satisfied. And though I couldn't immediately see why, I've learned never to mistake Holmes's silence for closure. One morning, as I read an editorial questioning whether Beckwith's legacy should be posthumously stripped of honors, Holmes spoke from his armchair, his voice calm but clipped. "There's still something missing, Watson. Something that doesn't quite align." Hartley claimed he orchestrated the cover-up to preserve reputation and silence Beckwith. But I've reviewed his correspondence with Glass, and there's a curious inconsistency. I lowered the paper and turned toward him. "What inconsistency?" I asked. Holmes didn't answer immediately. Instead, he rose and walked to the writing desk, retrieving a battered journal from the drawer. It was one of the original expedition logs, recovered from Glass's hiding place. He opened it with the care of a scholar examining an ancient text. "There," he said, pointing to a passage dated July 11th, 1896. "Beckwith writes, 'The Guardian returned last night, bloodied, broken, but alive. He spoke only to Hartley and demanded the feather back.'" Holmes looked up at me with narrowed eyes. "You see it now, don't you?" I furrowed my brow. "I thought Hartley always denied Kieferu returned." Holmes nodded. "Exactly. That's the lie. Hartley insisted, publicly and in private, that Kieferu vanished in Africa, presumed dead, but this entry confirms he returned, at least for a moment, and Hartley was not just aware, but directly involved." I leaned back in my chair, trying to piece it together. "So Kieferu returned, wounded. He wanted something back. The feather." Holmes nodded slowly. "The feather, Watson, was no mere tribal totem, according to the annotations later added by Glass. The black feather Kieferu carried was symbolic, part of a spiritual covenant. Beckwith, in his desperation to gain access to a sacred plateau, took the feather, believing it would earn him passage. In truth, it was a warning, a mark. By taking it, he violated a law not written in our language." I shivered slightly at the thought. "And when Kieferu returned to retrieve it, Hartley refused." Holmes returned to his chair, fingers steepled. "Refused? Yes, or worse, misled him. Perhaps Hartley promised to return it, but never did. Either way, Kieferu was silenced shortly after. That single act, the theft of the feather, set everything in motion. Beckwith's guilt, Hartley's scheming, Glass's madness. It wasn't just murder we were dealing with. It was a legacy built on betrayal." As we sat in silence, Mrs. Hudson entered with a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Another one for you, Mr. Holmes. No return address." Holmes took it with care, his face betraying a flicker of interest. He unwrapped the parcel to reveal a slender wooden box, old but intact. Inside, nestled in a bed of dark fabric, was a single feather, long, black, and unmistakably preserved. Alongside it, a torn scrap of parchment bore the words, "He never gave it back." Holmes stared at the feather for a long moment. "So this is it," he said quietly. "The original." "But who sent it?" I asked, bewildered. "Glass is in custody. Hartley is under guard." Holmes slowly closed the box. "Someone else, someone who wanted the truth to come full circle. Perhaps a witness who remained in the shadows, or even a descendant of Kifaru, watching, waiting for justice." I could see the tension lift slightly from his shoulders. It was rare for Holmes to allow emotion to rise. But in that moment, I saw something like respect cross his features. "This," he said, "is the final piece. The symbol that connected all the guilt, all the blood. And now, it has come home." Lestrade arrived later that afternoon with a few remaining loose ends from the case. He carried with him the confession letter from Glass, dictated under watch after days of initial silence. It detailed the plan to suppress Kifaru's appearance, the way Hartley had paid off the mission hospital, and how Beckwith, in his final months, had begun to write letters he never dared send. Letters that spoke of guilt, and of a man with a feather who had come to claim what was owed. Holmes listened patiently as Lestrade read the final lines aloud. "I did not kill Kifaru, but I allowed it to happen. I turned my face as the others did, and in doing so, I damned myself." When Lestrade left, Holmes returned to his desk and gently placed the feather inside a glass case. He affixed a small label below it. It read simply, "Returned at last." That night I found Holmes standing at the window, looking out at the street below. "Watson," he said without turning, "sometimes the greatest crime is not the act itself, but the silence that follows." I joined him at the window. The fog had lifted at last, and the lights of London twinkled below like distant fires. "Do you think this will be enough?" I asked. "To put the ghosts to rest?" Holmes exhaled slowly. "Perhaps not for everyone. But for Kifaru? I should like to think, yes." He turned from the window and tapped the side of the glass case gently. "Every crime has its echo, Watson. This one just happened to drift across continents, decades, and into our hands. We were not meant to solve it, but fate," he said with a faint smile, "has a curious habit of ignoring intent." And with that, he sat down, lit his pipe, and let the quiet take its rightful place again in our sitting room. The mystery, it seemed, was finally ready to rest. Chapter 15. The Final Gathering. The day of the final gathering began with a stillness that seemed to stretch through every corridor of Baker Street. Holmes rose early, his movements slow but deliberate, and I could tell the final pieces of the puzzle were locking into place in his mind. He spent much of the morning preparing his notes, arranging papers on the desk, and cross-referencing statements from Lestrade, Glass, and Morton. There was an air of inevitability about him, as if he knew the time had come to draw the curtain on the mystery that had consumed us for weeks. Around midday, a carriage arrived at our door, sent by Scotland Yard. Lestrade had secured a private room at the Royal Colonial Club on Pall Mall, a neutral and discreet venue suited for the confrontation Holmes had requested. Those summoned included Lord Hartley, under heavy guard, Professor Glass, still pale and rattled from his time in hiding, and young Morton, who had regained enough strength to attend under police supervision. Holmes had also requested the presence of two additional men, Sir Edwin Vale, the expedition's original financial patron, and Inspector Blakely, a minor colonial officer who had once served in South Africa and had briefly handled the mission hospital where Kifaru had last been seen. The room we entered was high-ceilinged and dimly lit, its windows drawn and the furniture sparse. A single long table stood in the center, with chairs arranged on either side. Lestrade stood by the door, arms folded, watching with suspicion as the attendees were escorted in. Hartley arrived last, flanked by 2 constables. He was calm, as always, though the deepening lines around his eyes betrayed a mounting fatigue. Holmes remained silent until all had taken their places. Then he stood at the head of the table and placed the glass case containing the black feather at its center. "I've gathered you all," Holmes began. "Not for the spectacle of accusation, but for the clarity of truth. Each of you played a role in the events that unfolded before and after the Beckwith expedition, some knowingly, others through omission. Today, the silence ends." There was a shifting of weight in the chairs. Glass stared at the feather, his lips trembling slightly. Morton glanced between the faces in the room, visibly anxious. Hartley sat motionless, his hands folded before him, the very picture of studied indifference. Holmes turned first to Vale. "Sir Edwin," he said, "you financed the expedition and insisted on its patriotic significance, but you also received, though never opened, a letter from Beckwith shortly before his death. In it, Beckwith expressed a desire to make public a truth that would unmake the legend. Do you deny this?" Vale swallowed. "I never read the letter. My secretary found it days after the funeral. It was burned." Holmes inclined his head. "Indeed, a convenient loss. Next," he addressed Blakely. "You served in the region when Kieferu was reportedly brought to the mission hospital. You allowed a man to remove the patient under the pretense of kinship and care. Did you ever verify the man's identity?" Blakely stiffened. "No, he was well-dressed, confident, claimed to be part of the expedition. I didn't question it." Holmes stepped closer to the table. And thus, the only man who could have confirmed the betrayal, the theft of the feather, was quietly removed, never to be seen again. There was a pause as Holmes allowed the weight of that statement to settle. Then he turned to Glass. "You, Professor, were complicit through silence, but you were also a victim. Manipulated by Lord Hartley, you believed the truth would destroy your reputation, your livelihood." Glass nodded, almost imperceptibly. "I was terrified. Hartley threatened to expose my debts, my falsified academic credentials. I thought if I stayed quiet, it would pass. But it never did." Holmes took a breath and faced Morton. "And you, young man, used as a messenger, a watcher. You were chosen because of your distance from the past, but you saw the consequences firsthand. You were nearly silenced for what you knew." Morton looked down, face pale. "I didn't understand it all. They told me it was just about protecting names. I didn't think anyone would die." Holmes raised his hand, stilling the growing tension in the room. "This is not a trial, though trials will follow. This is a reckoning. Lord Hartley." All eyes turned to the elder statesman. "You orchestrated the suppression of a man's voice, a culture's warning, and a legacy's integrity. You used your wealth and power to erase Kieferu's final act of resistance. You killed Beckwith not for what he did, but for what he was about to say. You preyed upon the weaknesses of others to preserve an illusion." Hartley's face did not change, but his eyes finally met Holmes's. "You speak of legacy, Mr. Holmes," he said coldly, "but you know nothing of empire. Sometimes silence is mercy." "No," Holmes replied, his voice firm. "Silence is complicity." He returned to the feather and tapped the glass gently. "This was never just a token. It was a warning. Beckwith ignored it. You buried it. But it has returned, and with it, the truth." Holmes stepped back, allowing the room to fall into a hush. The feather seemed to cast its own shadow, a delicate yet powerful symbol of the cost of deception. For a moment, no one spoke. Even Lestrade looked subdued. Then Holmes spoke one final time. "Justice," he said, "is not always found in the courts, but truth always finds its way to light." He turned and walked to the door. As we followed him out into the hall, I looked back once at the people gathered around the table. The feather lay still between them, but it felt, somehow, as if it had taken on a weight that none of them could bear to lift. Chapter 16. The Reveal. Holmes breaks down the crime. The air in our Baker Street sitting room felt unusually dense the morning after the gathering at the Royal Colonial Club. A pale sunlight streamed through the windows, warming the Persian rug beneath Holmes's feet. Yet neither of us remarked upon the weather. Holmes had risen before me, already deep in thought, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. I knew the silence well. He was preparing to unravel everything, not for himself, but for me. For once, this wasn't a puzzle he was solving, but a story he was ready to tell. He finally broke the silence without shifting his gaze. "There comes a point in every case, Watson, where one must stop chasing answers and instead arrange what one already knows. All the pieces are here. We've merely been looking at them from the wrong angle." I closed the notebook in my lap and sat forward. "Then let's see it from your angle, Holmes. From the beginning." He nodded, then began in a calm, measured tone. "It starts, as always, with motive. Not of money or passion, but of preservation. Lord Albert Strathmore. Hartley had long ago wrapped his identity in the veil of reputation. He funded and oversaw aspects of the Beckwith expedition not for scientific discovery, but to bolster colonial presence and cement his family's name in history. The expedition was supposed to be a triumph, a neatly packaged tale of English bravery and success in foreign lands. Holmes paused, letting the weight of that statement settle. But what they found, what Beckwith and his team did, was no triumph. They trespassed upon sacred ground. They manipulated Kieferu, a man not only a guide but a spiritual guardian of a site that should never have been approached. The black feather he carried was not decorative. It was a warning, a vow of protection. Beckwith stole it, believing it would grant him safe passage, and in doing so violated an oath far older than any map or charter. I sat back in my chair, recalling the feather's ominous beauty. That act, taking the feather, it set everything in motion. Holmes nodded. Precisely. What followed was no less than a collapse of every man's conscience. Beckwith, racked with guilt, began to unravel. Hartley's younger brother, Charles, initially tried to maintain control but was ultimately consumed by the shame. Glass fled into his own intellect, convinced that silence would protect him. But it was Albert, Lord Hartley, who took the most deliberate action. When Kieferu returned, injured and seeking the return of the feather, Hartley intervened. He removed the man from the hospital, ensured his disappearance, and buried the truth. And when Beckwith began to confess, Holmes met my eyes. Hartley could not allow it. Beckwith had written letters, prepared to speak to the Royal Society, perhaps even the press. But before he could, he was murdered. Hartley staged the scene as suicide, or something close to it. Scotland Yard, in their usual haste, accepted the surface evidence, but the room told a different story. I remembered that crime scene vividly. The strangest element had been the positioning of the chair, the unnatural angle of the body, and the feather left behind. So the feather at the scene, Holmes answered before I could finish, was planted, not as a clue, but as a message, a final taunt or perhaps a psychological manipulation intended to terrify those who were complicit. Glass, upon seeing it, began to lose his grip. Morton, who had only fragments of understanding, was used to deliver warnings and messages. When he got too close, too curious, he was abducted, not to be harmed, but to be frightened into silence. Holmes rose then, walking slowly to the cabinet where the feather now rested in its case. But fate has its own sense of order. The feather that was meant to silence ended up speaking louder than any man. Its very presence ignited a chain of events Hartley could not contain. He underestimated Glass's guilt, Beckwith's integrity, and, he smiled faintly, our tenacity. I watched him with admiration. And the letter you received, the one with the real feather and the note. That, Holmes said, tapping the glass gently, was the act of someone who knew the truth would eventually be found. I believe it came from a surviving relative of Kifaru, or perhaps a witness who had remained in the shadows all these years. Either way, they understood what that feather symbolized and returned it not to accuse, but to restore. He turned to me fully now. You see, Watson, this case was never simply about murder. It was about legacy, who controls it, and who suffers beneath its weight. Hartley believed his power could shape history. But history, like truth, is more patient than even he imagined. I stood, feeling the gravity of what we had uncovered. And now, what becomes of them? Glass will be tried, though his cooperation will earn him leniency. Morton, still a boy in many ways, will recover with time. Hartley, Holmes's expression darkened slightly, will face the law, though he's already begun to wither under the weight of his own undoing, and Kifaru, though gone, will have his story told at last. That is justice of a kind. The room was quiet once more. Outside, the sounds of London had returned to their usual rhythm. Carriages, street sellers, the distant bells of a church marking the hour. I glanced at the feather once more. So small, so fragile, yet the key to a story of betrayal, silence, and ultimately, truth. Holmes, sensing my thoughts, placed a hand on my shoulder. Never underestimate the smallest of things, Watson. A feather, a look, a hesitation. They often hold more weight than the grandest of gestures. It is not size that reveals truth, but detail. And with that, he returned to his armchair, relit his pipe, and let the smoke curl lazily into the air. The mystery had been revealed, the curtain drawn. All that remained now was for history to decide what to remember and what, at last, to set free. Chapter 17. Outcome and Justice. The days that followed Holmes's final explanation were marked by a quiet sense of closure. It was not a dramatic ending filled with applause or headlines praising the great detective, though I felt strongly that Holmes deserved every word of recognition. Instead, the events faded slowly into public record, buried among the court announcements and footnotes in society pages. But for those of us who lived through it, the conclusion carried a weight far greater than fanfare. Lord Hartley's trial was held under a heavy shroud of discretion. The Crown, wary of the political tremors such a scandal could cause, limited press attendance and sealed much of the evidence. But Holmes, Lestrade, and I attended each session, seated quietly behind the rail as witnesses gave their accounts. Professor Glass, pale and shaking, testified to the manipulation and fear he had lived under for years. Morton, though clearly nervous, stood bravely before the court, recounting the threats and strange instructions he had received during his employment with Hartley. The final blow came in the form of the letter recovered from Hartley's own safe, signed and sealed, outlining orders to intercept Beckwith's confession before it could be published. The jury did not deliberate long. Hartley was found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder, perjury, and obstruction of justice. His sentencing was to be carried out quietly, without spectacle. He was remanded to a private facility due to his age and rapidly declining health. Even in the face of judgment, he remained proud, never admitting guilt. But as Holmes noted quietly after the verdict, sometimes a man is sentenced long before the gavel falls. He knows he is no longer in control, and for someone like Hartley, that is the greatest punishment of all. Glass, for his part, received a reduced sentence in exchange for full cooperation. He was sentenced to 5 years, with the possibility of early release. I confess I felt pity for the man. Weak though he had been, it was clear he had been broken long ago, long before the case ever landed on our doorstep. Morton, fortunately, was spared criminal charges entirely. The court recognized him as a pawn, too young and too manipulated to be held responsible. He disappeared shortly after the trial, bound for Canada, Holmes believed, to start anew. In the weeks that followed, a curious thing began to happen. A small circle of academics and explorers began re-examining the Beckwith expedition, not through the lens of colonial glory, but as a cautionary tale. Holmes's discreet submission to the Royal Geographic Society, accompanied by the recovered letters and journals, sparked an internal review. Eventually, Beckwith's medals were posthumously removed from the museum's exhibit, and for the first time, the name Kieferu appeared in official records, not as a servant, but as a spiritual guide and protector of sacred lands. Holmes made no public statement about these changes, but I saw in his expression a quiet satisfaction. On one particular afternoon, as the leaves of early autumn drifted past our sitting-room window, Holmes handed me a letter addressed in elegant script. It was from Nairobi, and inside was a folded page of handmade paper. No name, no return address, just a brief message written in firm, careful strokes. Thank you for returning what was taken. The story is whole again. Beneath the words, pressed into the paper, was a single black feather. I looked up from the letter and found Holmes gazing into the hearth. So it was them, I said quietly. Someone from Kieferu's people. Holmes nodded. Justice takes many forms, Watson. Ours was one path, theirs perhaps another, but the end was the same. He placed the letter beside the case, holding the original feather, which he had returned to its place on the mantelpiece. It was no longer a clue. It was now a symbol of memory, of penance, of truth returned. Scotland Yard, as expected, released their official statement giving credit to the swift actions of their officers and the diligence of Lestrade. Holmes's name was not mentioned, nor mine, though the inspector did visit us privately soon after the final verdict. "You know," he said, rubbing his hands awkwardly, "I don't always say it, but, well, it wouldn't have come together without you, Holmes." Holmes offered a rare, genuine smile. "It rarely does, Lestrade. But I must say, your patience this time was unusually commendable." The compliment, vague though it was, lit the inspector's face with pride. "We make a good team," he said. "Even if it's your name the good doctor always puts in bold ink." He laughed and made his exit, tipping his hat on the way out. That night we dined quietly. Mrs. Hudson prepared roast lamb and potatoes, and Holmes, perhaps feeling the lightness of a closed case, allowed himself a second glass of Burgundy. We spoke little over the meal, content with the silence that had been absent from our flat for far too long. I caught Holmes staring once or twice at the feather case, as if still contemplating something unsaid. But I did not press him. I'd learned, over many cases and many years, that when Holmes goes quiet after a storm, it is not from doubt, but from peace. Later, as we sat by the fire, I took up my pen and turned to a fresh page in my journal. "You'll write it then?" Holmes asked without looking at me. I nodded. "Of course, every word, just as it happened." He gave a small nod. "Be fair to them, Watson. Even the weak ones. They were made that way by the weight they carried. Not all men are built to hold silence." And so, as the flames flickered and London slept beyond our window, I began the final lines of a case unlike any we had taken before. It was not the most violent, nor the most complex, but it was, perhaps, the most human. And somewhere, beyond the city, Beyond the courts and the institutions, I imagined a quiet village under African skies, where a story once stolen had finally come home. Chapter 18. Holmes's Final Reflection. It was some weeks later, on a chilly November morning, that I found Holmes once again seated at the window, watching the fog curl over Baker Street like slow-drifting smoke. He had been unusually silent since the resolution of the case. Not withdrawn, precisely, but pensive and less inclined toward his usual distractions. The violin had stayed untouched, the scrapbooks of criminal oddities remained closed, and not once had he reached for his monographs. Instead, he seemed content to observe the world pass him by in quiet reflection. I had just returned from a walk through Regent's Park, my boots still wet from the morning frost, when Holmes broke the silence. "Tell me, Watson, have you ever considered how fragile truth really is?" I looked up from removing my gloves. "You mean how easily it's buried?" He gave a faint smile. "Precisely. A man can live a lie for decades. An empire can write its history in half-truths and omissions. A single artifact, a feather in this case, can speak more honestly than 1,000 printed proclamations." I stepped closer and took the armchair opposite him. "You've been thinking about the case again?" I never stopped. He leaned forward slightly. "You see, Watson, what we uncovered in the matter of the Beckwith expedition was not simply a murder, nor even a conspiracy. It was the anatomy of a legacy, one stitched together by silence and preserved through intimidation. But the fascinating thing, the truly human thing, is how brittle it all turned out to be. A boy with questions, a scholar with guilt. A feather in a coat pocket. That was all it took for the entire illusion to collapse." I nodded slowly. "And yet, for all the effort Lord Hartley spent burying the truth in the end, it came back to the surface." "As it always does," Holmes replied, his voice soft. "Truth is stubborn. It may sleep, but it does not die." There was a long pause as we both sat in the stillness. Outside, the morning light fought against the fog, and the gas lamps flickered like sleepy eyes struggling to stay open. The feather still rested on the mantel, sealed beneath its glass dome, dark as night and silent as a tombstone. I could not look at it without recalling Kifaru, a man none of us had met, and yet whose presence had loomed over the entire affair like a ghost whispering from behind every lie. "What will you do with it?" I asked, gesturing toward the feather. "I've made arrangements," Holmes replied. "The artifact will be returned to the region where it originated. There's a museum in Nairobi that recently opened a wing dedicated to cultural restitution. It will be placed there, not as evidence, but as remembrance." I smiled. "You've become sentimental, Holmes." He raised an eyebrow, amused. "Hardly. I merely believe that closure, though not necessary for justice, is often necessary for peace." We were interrupted briefly by Mrs. Hudson bringing in the tea. She placed the tray down with a warm smile and a few choice mutterings about Mr. Holmes forgetting to eat again. After she left, Holmes poured 2 cups and handed me one with the steady grace of someone who had, in his own way, made peace with the shadows of this case. "You know," I said, taking a sip, "I've always thought of you as a man driven by logic above all, but this case, it touched something deeper in you. Something almost, dare I say, empathetic." Holmes didn't answer right away. He stared into his tea for a long moment before speaking. "It's easy to see the world as a puzzle to be solved, Watson. Easier still to separate oneself from the emotions that complicate deduction. But every so often, a case comes along that refuses to be just a problem. It becomes a mirror. You see yourself in the fears of others, in their weaknesses, in their silences, and when that happens, even the coldest logic must make room for something else. Something like justice? Perhaps. Or maybe just understanding." He stood then, and walked slowly to the mantel, where he paused in front of the feather's case. He didn't touch it, but his eyes lingered on it with the same mixture of reverence and melancholy I'd seen in a man looking at a photograph of someone long gone. Kifaru died alone, far from his home, stripped of what he was entrusted to guard, and yet in the end he spoke louder than any of us. I rose as well, joining him at the mantel. Because we listened. Holmes looked over at me, and for the first time in weeks his features softened into something close to a smile, not of triumph, but of quiet satisfaction. Yes, Watson? And that, I think, is what matters most. The clock on the mantel struck 11, and the chime echoed gently through the room. Holmes straightened his coat and reached for his pipe. Well, he said, no rest for the wicked. I received a telegram this morning from the ministry. A locked room in Exeter, a vanishing violinist, and a note in Greek. Shall we? I chuckled. Only if you promise me this one involves less colonial corruption and fewer deadly feathers. He tapped the end of his pipe thoughtfully. No promises, old friend. Only the pursuit of truth. And with that, we stepped out into the London fog once more. Detective and doctor, logic and empathy, ready again to chase the shadows until they yielded to the light.